The hands wouldn't stop trembling. Lieutenant Colonel José Alberto Albano do Amarante sat across from the military physician in a Sao Paulo medical facility, watching the doctor's face as he reviewed blood work results for the third time. The doctor's expression told him everything before a single word was spoken. Something was very wrong. The physician asked about recent exposures, chemical work, radiation protocols. Amarante answered each question mechanically, while his mind raced backward through the previous 3 months. He thought about the foreign consultant with the slight accent who'd been so helpful at the centrifuge facility, so interested in the enrichment specifications, so friendly over those long technical discussions. The consultant had touched his coffee cup once, Amarante remembered, had asked to borrow his pen. Small moments that meant nothing at the time. The doctor was still talking, mentioning unusual markers in the blood, cellular abnormalities, organ function declining faster than any natural disease process could explain. Amarante's trembling hands gripped the edge of the examination table. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this to him, and he was starting to understand why. Before we find out what happened to Lieutenant Colonel Amarante and whether his suspicions held any truth, I want to let you know what this channel is about. Every single day, I bring you real intelligence operations. Not Hollywood fiction, but actual events that shaped the hidden battles of the Cold War and beyond. We're talking documented tradecraft, genuine consequences, and the human cost behind classified operations that changed history. If you're fascinated by the real world of espionage, the operations that never made headlines until decades later, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear involves Brazil's secret nuclear program, multiple intelligence services watching from the shadows, and a conspiracy theory that emerged from very real fears. The truth is more complex and more compelling than the legend. And real quick before we dive back in, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below with your city and country. Are you in Sao Paulo, where some of these events unfolded? Tel Aviv? Washington? It's always amazing to see how far these intelligence stories reach across the globe. Let me know in the comments. Now, back to Brazil in the late 1970s. To understand what happened to Amarante, or what people believe happened, you need to understand the nuclear program he was part of. Brazil's military dictatorship, which had ruled since 1964, decided the country needed complete independence in the nuclear fuel cycle. Not just power reactors, not just research. They wanted the ability to enrich uranium to whatever level they chose, with no foreign oversight, no international inspections, and no questions from the IAEA. This wasn't the civilian nuclear program that Brazil acknowledged publicly. This was something else entirely. The military called it the parallel program, and it operated in the shadows of legitimate research facilities, funded through black budgets that never appeared in official records. The Centro Técnico Aeroespacial, the CTA, became the nerve center for this work. Located in São José dos Campos, the facility expanded rapidly in the late 70s. New buildings appeared. Foreign consultants arrived. Equipment from Germany, including high-speed centrifuge components, began showing up in unmarked shipments. The Brazilian Air Force ran the operation, which meant officers like Amarante found themselves working on projects that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. He wasn't a nuclear physicist. His background was in aerospace engineering and material science. But the parallel program needed people who understood complex technical systems, who could manage classified projects, and who could keep their mouths shut. Amarante fit the profile perfectly. By 1980, Brazil's nuclear ambitions had caught the attention of multiple foreign intelligence services. The Americans were worried. The country had refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, maintaining that it had every right to develop whatever technology it wanted for peaceful purposes. Washington didn't buy the peaceful part. CIA station chiefs in Brasilia sent regular reports back to Langley detailing the expansion of enrichment research and the military's increasing control over nuclear materials. The Germans were conflicted. They'd sold Brazil some of the technology, but now worried about where it might lead. And Israel was watching very carefully. Tel Aviv had a long memory when it came to nuclear proliferation in regions where they had strategic interests. They'd destroyed Iraq's Osirak reactor in Operation Opera just months earlier, in June 1981. That operation sent a clear message. Israel would act unilaterally to prevent hostile nuclear programs from reaching maturity. But Brazil wasn't Iraq. The military regime in Brasilia had no hostility toward Israel. They maintained diplomatic relations, engaged in some defense cooperation, and posed no direct threat to Israeli security. The concern in Tel Aviv was more subtle and more strategic. Brazil was developing the capability to enrich uranium to weapons-grade levels. Once that capability existed, Brazil could sell that technology or enriched material to countries that were hostile to Israel. Libya was shopping for nuclear assistance. Iraq, despite the Osirak strike, was rebuilding its program. Iran, in the chaos following the Islamic Revolution, was desperate for nuclear expertise. If Brazil became a supplier in this marketplace, Israel's security calculus would fundamentally change. So Mossad began monitoring Brazil's nuclear network. This much is documented. Declassified cables from the early 80s, partially leaked during a political scandal decades later, show that Israeli intelligence tracked Brazil's centrifuge progress and worried specifically about Brazil selling enrichment technology to states like Iraq or Libya. They had sources inside the international nuclear supply chain. They cultivated relationships with scientists who traveled between countries. They watched, they listened, and they gathered intelligence. What they didn't do, according to every credible source, every declassified document, every intelligence history written since, was assassinate Brazilian nuclear scientists. But that's the theory we need to examine, because it grew out of very real circumstances and very genuine fears. Lieutenant Colonel Amarante was exactly the kind of officer who would have drawn intelligence interest. He had access to enrichment research. He traveled occasionally to meet with foreign suppliers. He knew which components were coming from Germany, which materials were being sourced domestically, and which facilities were actually producing results versus which were cover operations. In the world of intelligence collection, someone like Amarante represented a high-value target, not for elimination but for recruitment. If CIA or Mossad or BND could flip him, could turn him into a source, they'd have a window into Brazil's most sensitive nuclear work. That's how intelligence services actually operate. They recruit, they cultivate, they build networks of human sources who provide information over years. But recruiting someone inside a military dictatorship's classified nuclear program came with enormous risks. The Brazilian SNI, Serviço Nacional de Informações, ran an aggressive counterintelligence operation. They assumed foreign services were trying to penetrate the nuclear program, and they watched their own people carefully. A declassified but heavily redacted Air Force memo from the early 80s referenced foreign intelligence presence in scientific institutions and persistent attempts at eliciting technical details from officers. The memo didn't name which foreign services, but it made clear that Brazilian counterintelligence knew they were being targeted. Officers received briefings about recruitment approaches. They were told to report any suspicious contacts with foreigners. The paranoia wasn't irrational. It was based on actual attempts that Brazilian intelligence had detected and disrupted. Into this environment of surveillance and counter-surveillance walked a parade of foreign consultants. The parallel program needed expertise that Brazil didn't have domestically. German engineers helped with centrifuge design. There were consultants from Argentina, which had its own advanced nuclear program. Some technical advisors were Israeli, brought in for specific projects. Others were Polish immigrants who'd settled in Brazil years earlier, but maintained connections to European technical networks. This created a perfect breeding ground for conspiracy theories, because when something went wrong, when an officer got sick, or a project failed, or information leaked, the natural question became, which of these foreign consultants isn't who they claim to be? The intelligence activity around Brazil's nuclear program was real and documented. CIA made recruitment attempts. A former Brazilian Air Force officer, speaking in oral histories recorded in the 1990s, described being approached at an engineering conference in the United States by someone who claimed to work for a defense contractor but asked very specific questions about enrichment work at CTA. The officer reported the contact when he returned to Brazil. Another scientist recalled a German colleague who seemed far too interested in personnel assignments and security procedures. These weren't imagined threats. Foreign services were actively trying to recruit sources inside the program. What made the situation more complex was that some recruitment attempts might have succeeded. Intelligence services don't announce their victories. If CIA or Mossad managed to flip someone inside the parallel program, that person would have continued working normally, passing information through dead drops or encrypted communications, maintaining their cover for years. This brings us to the minor diplomatic incident that later fed the assassination narrative. In late 1980, an Israeli commercial attaché stationed in Brasilia was quietly relocated. The official explanation given to Brazilian authorities was portfolio restructuring. The embassy was reorganizing its trade mission, and this particular official was being reassigned to another posting. But Brazilian intelligence suspected something else. The SNI had been watching this attaché because his pattern of contacts didn't match normal commercial work. He'd met with university researchers, attended technical conferences, and traveled to São José dos Campos twice in 6 months. When he left Brazil suddenly, SNI analysts noted the timing. It coincided with a period when the Air Force had tightened security protocols after discovering that technical specifications for centrifuge components had been photographed without authorization. No one was ever charged. No spy was ever caught. But the sudden departure of the Israeli attaché raised questions that were never officially answered. Was he intelligence? Almost certainly. Commercial attachés often serve as cover for intelligence officers, and his behavior pattern matched collection activities rather than trade promotion. Did he run sources inside the nuclear program? Possibly. The timing of his departure suggests he might have been burned or that Brazilian counterintelligence got too close. But here's what matters. This incident became part of the evidence cited years later to support the theory that Mossad was running active operations against Brazilian nuclear scientists. The logic went like this. If Israel had one intelligence officer posing as a trade representative, who else did they have in country? Which consultants were actually Mossad? And if they were willing to conduct espionage, were they willing to go further? Lieutenant Colonel Amarante's health began declining in late 1981. The symptoms started subtly. Fatigue that didn't respond to rest, occasional nausea, headaches that came and went. He attributed it to stress at first. The parallel program was entering a critical phase. Brazil was close to achieving its first successful uranium enrichment using domestically built centrifuges. The pressure on officers like Amarante was intense. Long hours, classified work that couldn't be discussed even with family, and the constant awareness that foreign intelligence services might be watching. Stress seemed like the obvious explanation. But the symptoms didn't improve. They got worse. His hands developed a tremor. Blood tests showed abnormalities that his physicians couldn't immediately explain. By early 1982, Amarante was undergoing extensive medical evaluation at military facilities in São Paulo. What the doctors found was puzzling. His cellular markers suggested some kind of toxic exposure, but the pattern didn't match any common industrial chemical. His organ function was declining: liver, kidneys, bone marrow, in a way that suggested systemic poisoning rather than a specific disease. The medical team considered various possibilities. Could it be occupational exposure to something at CTA? The facility worked with various hazardous materials, though enrichment work itself wasn't supposed to involve direct exposure to highly radioactive substances at the levels that would cause these symptoms. They tested for heavy metal poisoning. They considered autoimmune disorders. Nothing fit perfectly. And while this was happening to Amarante, something else was occurring that wouldn't be fully understood until years later. Other officers in nuclear-related units were getting sick too. The pattern wasn't obvious at the time, because the illnesses were spread across different facilities and different units. But when researchers eventually looked back at Brazilian Air Force medical records from that era, they found something disturbing. 3 officers from nuclear-related units developed cancers or organ failure in the early 80s. 2 airframe test engineers who'd worked on projects tangentially connected to the nuclear program had similar unexplained illnesses. A health physics technician, someone whose job was specifically to monitor radiation exposure, died of complications that his family believed were work-related. At the time, each case was treated individually. The Air Force's medical system attributed the illnesses to various causes: occupational hazards, environmental factors, bad luck. An internal investigation eventually concluded that poorly controlled industrial radiography and hazardous material mishandling were responsible for some of the cancers. Radiation exposure from equipment used in materials testing, not from nuclear weapons work, had likely caused several of the cases. But this explanation came later, after Amarante was already sick, and it was never fully publicized. What military families knew was that officers working on sensitive projects were dying, and no one was giving them clear answers about why. This information vacuum, the gap between what happened and what was officially acknowledged, created space for alternative theories to develop. When Amarante's condition worsened despite treatment, when he died in circumstances that his family felt were never adequately explained, the questions began. Was this really occupational exposure, or was something else happening? The Brazilian SNI quietly investigated Amarante's case. Analysts examined his hospital records, reviewed his foreign contacts, traced his travel patterns over the previous year. They were looking for evidence of foul play, evidence that a foreign intelligence service might have poisoned him. The investigation found nothing actionable. No suspicious contacts that couldn't be explained, no clear vector for how a poison might have been administered, no forensic evidence of an assassination. But here's the crucial detail. The results of that investigation remained classified for years. The SNI didn't publish a report saying we investigated and found nothing suspicious. They simply filed their findings and moved on. This classification, this official silence, allowed speculation to flourish. If the investigation had found nothing wrong, why not say so? The absence of information looked like a cover-up, even though the actual reason for classification was probably mundane: protecting investigative methods, avoiding diplomatic complications, or simply following standard procedures for keeping intelligence assessments secret. Still, to Amarante's colleagues and family, the silence felt like confirmation that something had been hidden. The original rumors that circulated in the early 80s suggested poisoning or medical malpractice. Some people believed Amarante had been deliberately exposed to something at CTA, and that the military was covering it up to avoid accountability. Others thought his death might have been arranged by hardliners within the military regime itself, internal politics gone lethal. A few people whispered about foreign intelligence, but those early whispers were vague. They mentioned CIA more often than Mossad, actually. Brazilian officers, when they spoke privately about foreign pressure on the nuclear program, consistently focused on American opposition. Washington had been vocal in its concern. The U.S. had leverage through international financial institutions. When Brazilian officers imagined foreign interference, they imagined Americans pulling strings, not Israelis conducting assassinations. The specific theory that Mossad assassinated Amarante using radioactive poisoning didn't appear until the mid-90s, more than a decade after his death. This timing matters enormously. By 1994, the Cold War was over. Declassified documents were revealing intelligence operations that had been secret for decades. Books about spy tradecraft were hitting bestseller lists. The attempted assassination of Khalid Mashal by Mossad in Jordan hadn't happened yet. That was 1997. But Israel's history of targeted killings was well documented, and the world had learned about exotic assassination methods used by intelligence services. Radioactive poisoning was still mostly in the realm of theory at this point. Alexander Litvinenko's polonium-210 assassination wouldn't occur until 2006, but the concept existed in intelligence literature and spy fiction. A Brazilian journalist began investigating Amarante's case in this environment. He interviewed former colleagues, reviewed what medical records he could access, and tried to make sense of the pattern of illnesses among Air Force officers. He noted the timing, that Amarante's decline had coincided with the most sensitive phase of Brazil's nuclear program. He discovered the declassified memo about foreign intelligence presence in scientific institutions. He learned about the Israeli attaché who'd been quietly relocated. And he found something else that seemed significant: the small community of Iranian nuclear scientists who'd been working in Sao Paulo during the early 80s. These were engineers who'd fled Iran after the Islamic Revolution, when the new regime purged scientists associated with the Shah's nuclear program. Some had ended up in Brazil working on metallurgy, reactor materials, and other technical projects that were nuclear adjacent, but not directly part of Brazil's weapons research. The presence of Iranian scientists in Brazil was almost completely unknown outside intelligence circles. It hadn't been publicized because Brazil didn't want attention on who was working in its technical sector, and the Iranian refugees wanted to avoid notice from Tehran's intelligence services. But to someone looking for connections between Brazil's nuclear work and international intelligence operations, this detail seemed explosive. If Mossad knew that Iranian nuclear scientists were in Sao Paulo, would they have conducted surveillance? Absolutely. Would they have tried to track what those scientists were doing, who they were working with, whether they might return to Iran and bring Brazilian nuclear knowledge with them? Without question. Did this make Brazil look like an indirect proliferation hub from Israel's perspective? Potentially. The journalist published his theory in 1996. He argued that Amarante had been assassinated by a Mossad operative who'd been embedded in Brazil as a foreign consultant. He claimed the assassin's name was Samuel Gilead, though in some versions of the story the name appeared as Gweston Zang. According to the theory, this operative was of Polish birth, had worked undercover in Brazil's nuclear facilities, and had been specifically tasked with neutralizing scientists who possessed sensitive knowledge about uranium enrichment. The method, the journalist claimed, was radioactive contamination, a slow poisoning designed to look like occupational exposure or natural illness. Amarante had been deliberately exposed to radioactive material over a period of months, causing the cellular damage and organ failure that eventually killed him. The story spread through conspiracy literature and fringe publications. It fit into a larger narrative about Israeli operations to prevent nuclear proliferation. Israel had bombed Iraq's reactor. Israel would later be suspected in the assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists. Israel had the capability, the motive, and the history of acting unilaterally when it perceived existential threats. The theory about Amarante's assassination became accepted fact in certain circles, cited in books about intelligence operations, and repeated in forums discussing Mossad's reach. But there was a fundamental problem with every aspect of this story. No evidence supported any of it. Start with the names. Samuel Gilead and Gweston Zang don't appear in any Mossad history, any whistleblower account, any defector testimony, or any intelligence archive. When former Mossad officer Viktor Ostrovsky published his explosive memoirs revealing the agency's methods and operations, he named real operatives and described real missions. The names Gilead and Zang weren't there. When Michael Bar Zohar and Nissan Mishal published their comprehensive histories of Mossad operations, detailing assassinations from the 1970s through the 2000s, they documented operations in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Brazil wasn't mentioned. No operation targeting nuclear scientists in South America appeared in their research. The names don't match Israeli identity patterns either. Mossad officers operating undercover typically use names that fit their cover identity. European names for European operations, Arab names for Middle Eastern operations. The combination of Samuel Gilead and Gweston Zang is odd enough that intelligence researchers have concluded these names were likely invented by the journalist, or were mistranslations from Polish or Yiddish names that got garbled in retelling. Then there's the method. Radioactive assassination is extraordinarily difficult, extraordinarily risky, and extraordinarily traceable. When Russian intelligence services assassinated Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006 using polonium-210, they left a radioactive trail across the city. The poison was detected in restaurants, hotel rooms, airplanes, everywhere the assassins had been. British authorities traced the polonium back to Russian nuclear facilities. The operation became an international incident precisely because radioactive materials leave signatures that are nearly impossible to hide. If Mossad had used radioactive poisoning in Brazil in the early 80s, there would have been forensic evidence. Hospital equipment would have shown contamination. Medical personnel would have been exposed. The material would have been traceable to its source. Specific reactors produce specific isotopes with identifiable characteristics. None of this appeared in Brazilian medical or investigative records related to Amarante. Mossad's actual assassination methods, documented across dozens of operations, favored directness and deniability. Car bombs that look like accidents. Gunshots delivered by motorcycle teams that disappear into traffic. Poisonings using toxins that degrade quickly or mimic natural causes. Thallium, cyanide derivatives, compounds that cause heart attacks or strokes. When Mossad killed Gerald Bull, the Canadian engineer designing supergun artillery for Iraq, they shot him in Brussels. When they eliminated Mahmoud al-Mabhouh in Dubai, they used a drug-induced heart attack. These methods are quick, relatively clean, and don't leave radioactive evidence that scientists can trace for decades. The idea that Mossad would choose the most complicated, most traceable, most risky method available doesn't match how the organization actually operates. I have to pause here and ask you something. If you were a Brazilian nuclear scientist in this era, knowing that foreign intelligence services were watching, seeing colleagues getting sick from what you were told was workplace exposure, hearing rumors that maybe it wasn't just accidents, would you have continued your work or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious how you'd navigate that impossible choice between patriotic duty and personal survival, between serving your country's strategic ambitions and protecting yourself and your family from risks you couldn't fully assess, because several Brazilian scientists did walk away during this period, requesting transfers out of the nuclear program or leaving military service entirely. Were they paranoid, or were they the smart ones? Here's what actually happened to Brazil's nuclear program and why it slowed down. Amarante died in circumstances that remain officially unresolved. Other officers got sick from what was likely occupational exposure to hazardous materials during an era when safety protocols weren't as rigorous as they should have been. But the parallel program's decline had nothing to do with Israeli assassinations. It had everything to do with internal Brazilian politics and economics. By the mid-80s, Brazil's military dictatorship was ending. The process of democratization brought civilian oversight to programs that had operated in complete secrecy. Budget crises forced cuts to expensive research projects that weren't producing immediate results. Public pressure mounted against military control of nuclear policy, especially after details of the parallel program began leaking to journalists. Environmental groups opposed nuclear development. Scientists within the program itself began questioning whether weapons research was the right direction for Brazil's nuclear policy. These were powerful forces that had nothing to do with foreign intelligence operations. When Brazil finally signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1998, becoming one of the last significant holdouts to join the international non-proliferation regime, it reflected a fundamental strategic reorientation. The country decided that being part of the international system, with access to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes and recognition as a responsible actor, was more valuable than maintaining the option for weapons development. This decision came from Brazilian leadership, not from external pressure or covert operations. Foreign intelligence services had watched the program, had tried to recruit sources, had lobbied their governments to pressure Brazil through diplomatic and economic channels. but they hadn't killed anyone. The documented evidence from declassified archives tells a very different story than the assassination theory. Yes, Mossad monitored Brazil's nuclear ties with Iraq and Argentina during the 1980s. Yes, Israeli intelligence tracked potential uranium exports and technology transfers that might threaten Israeli security. But the focus of Israeli concern was Argentina's heavy water production, Chile's European nuclear contacts, and Bolivia's uranium mining deals. Brazil was on the radar as a potential future supplier of enriched uranium, but not as a direct proliferation threat requiring direct action. The classified Israeli cable that mentioned concerns about Brazilian centrifuge autonomy was about preventing Brazil from selling technology to hostile states, not about assassinating Brazilian scientists. Intelligence services distinguish between monitoring threats and eliminating threats. Brazil fell into the monitoring category. Brazilian military officers genuinely believed they were being watched during this period, and they were right. Multiple intelligence services ran collection operations targeting the parallel program. CIA tried to recruit insiders. This is documented in officer testimony. The attempts were clumsy enough that Brazilian counterintelligence detected them. German intelligence services probably monitored the program too, since German companies had sold Brazil centrifuge technology, and Bonn wanted to know how it was being used. Israeli intelligence definitely watched for signs that Brazil might become a proliferation hub. Soviet intelligence almost certainly had sources tracking Brazil's nuclear progress, since Moscow wanted to know about any country developing weapons capability in the Western Hemisphere. This wasn't paranoia. This was the reality of operating a secret nuclear program during the Cold War. Every major intelligence service paid attention. But paying attention isn't the same as assassination. When the theory about Amarante's death emerged in the mid-90s, it reflected several things converging at once. First, genuine mysteries about why multiple officers had gotten sick and died. Second, the documented presence of foreign intelligence operations around the nuclear program. Third, the classified SNI investigation whose results were never made public. Fourth, Israel's well-known history of acting aggressively against nuclear proliferation. Fifth, the cultural moment of the mid-90s when Cold War secrets were being revealed and people were learning just how far intelligence services had been willing to go. All of these elements combined to create a conspiracy theory that felt plausible, even though it wasn't supported by evidence. The theory persists because it tells a story that makes sense of otherwise random tragedies. If Amarante died from workplace exposure to radiation due to inadequate safety measures, that's a bureaucratic failure. Terrible, but mundane. If he was assassinated by Mossad, that's a dramatic spy story with clear villains and victims. People want the second story to be true because it's more compelling, more meaningful, and frankly more comforting than the idea that he died for nothing, from preventable causes that should have been avoided through better safety protocols. The conspiracy theory gives his death significance beyond bureaucratic negligence. It makes him a casualty of international intelligence wars rather than a victim of institutional failure. But wanting a story to be true doesn't make it true. The radioactive poisoning detail only appeared a decade after the events, mirroring the broader cultural awareness of exotic assassination methods that emerged in the 90s. Earlier rumors had suggested conventional poisoning or medical malpractice. The evolution of the theory over time is actually evidence against its validity. If witnesses had seen something genuinely suspicious when Amarante was alive, if his colleagues had noticed a foreign consultant acting strangely, if doctors had found clear evidence of deliberate poisoning, if the SNI investigation had discovered actual proof of foreign involvement, those details would have been part of the story from the beginning. Instead, the theory grew more elaborate as time passed, and as new information about intelligence tradecraft entered public knowledge. This is how conspiracy theories typically develop. They incorporate new details from unrelated events, retrofitting them onto old mysteries to create a more complete narrative. What we're left with is this: Lieutenant Colonel José Alberto Albano. Do Amarante was a Brazilian Air Force officer who worked on his country's classified nuclear program during an era of intense international attention and genuine espionage. He got sick in circumstances that were never fully explained to his family's satisfaction. Other officers in similar positions also developed serious illnesses, likely from occupational exposure to hazardous materials in an era before modern safety standards. Foreign intelligence services ran operations targeting the program, trying to recruit sources, gathering technical information, and reporting back to their governments about Brazil's nuclear progress. Israel worried that Brazil might become a supplier to hostile states and monitored the situation closely. All of this is documented and real. But the assassination theory, that a Mossad operative named Samuel Gilead, or Guestin Zong, poisoned Amarante with radioactive material in a covert operation to disrupt Brazil's nuclear program, has no supporting evidence. The names don't appear in any intelligence history. The method doesn't match Mossad's documented assassination techniques. The forensic evidence that would necessarily accompany radioactive poisoning doesn't exist. The declassified archives from both Brazil and Israel contain no reference to such an operation. And the timing of when the theory emerged, more than a decade after the events, suggests it was constructed from genuine historical elements combined with emerging knowledge about intelligence tradecraft, rather than based on contemporary witness accounts or evidence. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey through one of the lesser-known corners of Cold War intelligence history. This channel brings you real spy stories every single day, operations that shaped history, tradecraft that reveals how intelligence services actually work, and the human cost behind classified programs that change the world. We examine both the documented facts and the conspiracy theories that grow around them, because understanding the difference between what we know and what we believe is crucial. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Tomorrow we're diving into another intelligence operation, and I guarantee you haven't heard this story before. So, what do you think? Was this a case of legitimate geopolitical anxiety being misinterpreted years after the fact? Or is there still something hidden in those classified files that hasn't been revealed? Could the SNI investigation have found evidence that was suppressed for diplomatic reasons? Or is this exactly what it appears to be? A tragedy of inadequate workplace safety during a secretive military program that later got transformed into a spy thriller through speculation and selective interpretation of facts? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing your perspectives on these intelligence mysteries, where the truth isn't always as dramatic as the legend. The real story of Brazil's parallel nuclear program remains remarkable even without the assassination theory. A military dictatorship pursued weapons capability outside international oversight. Multiple foreign intelligence services ran operations to penetrate the program. Officers died from exposure to hazardous materials that should have been better controlled. The program eventually ended not through covert action, but through democratic reform and strategic reorientation. Sometimes the documented history is more compelling than the conspiracy. Sometimes the truth about bureaucratic failure and occupational hazards is harder to accept than a clean narrative about spies and assassinations. And sometimes the most important intelligence lesson is learning to distinguish between what intelligence services actually do and what we imagine they might do when confronted with mysterious deaths and classified programs. Lieutenant Colonel Amarante deserved better than the safety protocols that failed him. His story deserves better than conspiracy theories unsupported by evidence. The truth matters, even when it's less dramatic than the legend.